Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have with us Mr. Jason Thacker, who's a senior fellow at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission and assistant professor of philosophy and ethics at Southern Seminary and Boyce College. We have with us Dr. Alan Martin, who's the director of public affairs and religious liberty for the Northeastern Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We also have with us Mr. Wang, who's the general counsel and director of public affairs and religious liberty for the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have Ms. Blayre Marley, who's the director and legal corporate counsel for a Fortune 500 company. Great to have you guys here with us and looking forward to our conversation for today. You know, I was recently looking at some information, and what I would call a thesis that came out of this information is where AI thrives, religion may struggle. You know, there's been a series of studies that suggest that there is an inverse relationship between automation and religiosity. In many countries, it's common to see former church buildings being turned into apartments, offices, and even bars. And this trend seems to point to this kind of broad global decline in religious affiliation and identity. You know, the United States has seen one of the biggest drops in terms of individuals or residents who belong to a church, a synagogue, or a mosque. And it looks like that number has dropped since 1999 by almost 70% to 47% now. But there's one potential factor in all of this, and that is the ever increasing activity of AI or artificial intelligence. That deals with robotics. That deals with all kinds of what we would call new ways of communicating, creating communication that's not coming directly from an individual, but from artificial intelligence. You know, Jason, you and I have had a chance to kind of look at some of these issues, and I've had a chance to read a lot of your writings, but it seems as though there is this idea that the idea of AI and maybe religion cannot peacefully coexist, or if they are coexisting, can I trust what I'm seeing? You know, what have you been seeing out there, and how do you help to advise individuals to kind of better understand the strengths and the weaknesses and how it may relate to religious issues?
Yeah, I find the study quite interesting. One, I can't tell if it's causation or correlation. I do think it's speaking to the reality, though, that technology shapes us and forms us. I think that's something that we lost. We often think of technology as just merely a tool we can use. We can use it for good, we can use it for ill, but I think one of the ways we can think about it is technology is also using us, it's shaping us, it's forming us, our perspective of God, our perspective of what does it mean to be human, which I think is one of the central questions of our day across issues, but specifically in the technology conversation with AI, as well as the world around us. Technology is not neutral in that sense of doing something to us. So whether this is causation or correlation, I nevertheless think it's speaking to the reality technology shaping us and forming us, and there is a significant decline in religious affiliation. And whether those things are directly connected together or speaking to larger realities and larger cultural shifts, I think one of the things that we can do is to slow down to think, hey, a lot of times these simplistic narratives of this plus this and we get to this place, it's a lot more complex than that. Nevertheless, we do see with the power of technology, it fools us often to think that we can control things, we can shape things, we can control, we no longer need a God because we're gods unto ourselves. And so I think a study like this helps us to see that technology is not neutral, it's doing something to us. It's not just the way we use it, but maybe that it's actually using us.
You know, Blayre, in our society, we're starting to see in particular a younger generation that's kind of almost shaping their own religion and calling it their religion. And in a way, we've even seen, and I've seen some of Jason's writings that say that more people seem to be learning about God and religion through, quote unquote, the internet and other social media and even AI than even going to church anymore. You know, so, you know, when you see some of these ideas, and I guess the question is, can this AI and can this social media and artificial intelligence and all of this, quote unquote, activity peacefully coexist in the religious community?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I do think that religious communities can benefit from that, right? There's an app now that's called, I think, Bible Study Chat. And on that app, people are able to ask what would be common biblical questions, right? The questions do not have a denominational tie, but it might be, you know, who were the first man, first woman, according to the Bible, right? You get Adam and Eve, right? Those are some of the positive things. You get quick answers. Maybe pastors aren't able to answer that as quickly because they're busy, right? They're busy visiting their congregation and, helping on the ground there. Nevertheless, I do think it's a slippery slope. I think a lot of people have found themselves turning to technology as a God. I mean, one of the things I think Jason said is like a God within ourselves, right? People are beginning to have this God complex. And why do I need God if I can create on my own? AI has kind of given us this idea that we can create on our own as humans, and we can kind of make artificial intelligence. The internet is filled with people changing the narrative using AI, right? You can see an actor who was in one movie, and then they will take AI, play with some of the algorithm, and then change the way that actor appears, the movie, and all of that. I think that's very dangerous. But I do think there's some benefits to it. And if Christians can figure out how to leverage that and leverage that technology, we can really see growth in our church and address in our community by reaching them in a way that they understand by using technology.
Dr. Martin, you got an interesting perspective, really, in a city like in New York, where, you've been someone who has probably seen where the church has been, where you only came into the church by coming in and hearing a sermon and coming up and learning and doing more Bible studies. But you've also have to learn how to really kind of, jump into a new generation of activity, because that's now the only way you can reach people. And it seems like some of the work in New York and other major cities have done a pretty good job of that. Can you tell us a little bit of how your experience is, or even how this has been hitting you in an interesting way?
Well, to be very honest with you, I'm a little old school, so it's a little new to me. I'm a baby boomer. My millennials and my other generations are far ahead of me in regards to this. But if you're going to be a pastor in today's society of a church, this is a reality. This is part of the culture. And you have to be ready to adjust to this change in the culture. I agree with what my previous speaker said. It's not all negative. There's a lot of positives here. But I do believe there has to be an educational orientation process for our churches to understand how to capitalize and to use AI to the advantage or the furtherance of the gospel. All right. The word tells us what did the Lord Daniel say? That in the last days, men will go to and fro because of knowledge will be increased. Well, let's face it. AI is part of that equation from a biblical narrative. And so therefore, I think it's time for us to look at how we can use AI, because if we don't, we're going to lose a whole generation. We've got all these young people out there. This is what they do. When they come to church, it's hard to get the attention because they're looking at that cell phone. They're looking at that iPad. Okay. So we have to find a way to integrate what we preach, how we propagate the gospel into communicating in the language that they now understand and speak.
Andre, Pacific Northwest, probably one of the more liberal parts of the world, where there are things that you accept there that maybe 3,000 miles away in the same country folk are uncomfortable with. But it seems like the real question with AI is not so much whether it can be good or bad. The question is, can I trust what I see? And I think that's what seems to be the tricky part here. How do you help when you're trying to work in conjunction from a legal perspective or from a moral perspective? How can you help people to trust what they see and know that it might be actually the real thing?
Yeah, so the question, what is AI? On basic terms, it's technology that allows a computer to think like a human. And for those of us that believe in intelligent design, believe that there's a higher being that allows a human to think like a human. But with AI, now we are presented with the question, can artificial intelligence now do what God does? We now have churches that are using AI. ChatGPT is writing sermons robots are delivering sermons, giving advice, even praying with parishioners, kind of like a Christian Alexa. And let me just say, robots are superior. They're always thinking of the best way to do things. They're constantly evolving, and they never die. And so, from a spirituality perspective, can they really kind of pass on beliefs to other generations? So, the Catholic Church in Poland actually has developed a robot called Santo, a robot priest with 2,000 years of Catholic knowledge. And the developer says anything that brings you closer to God is a good thing, making religion more accessible, more interactive, and improving spirituality. But the robot controlling both human and religion, is that really what God wants? So I think that's an essential question here.
Well, Jason, how do you get people to trust? Because that seems to be the real question. I mean, I don't think anybody would ever say technology would be unusable and whoever utilizes it can decide whether you use it for good or evil. But it seems like the real question is, and particularly with the younger generation, if they don't trust what they see, they discard. And so how do you deal with the trust factor as you go out and teach and train and even get people to be comfortable with this?
Yeah, it speaks to something Blayre mentioned earlier about, the way that technology does to us is it shapes us, informs us, and it often changes our perspective of reality and specifically truth and knowledge. We see that with the misinformation debate, with conspiracy theories and fake news, and then not only the ability to share these things with tens of followers or tens of thousands of followers using social media, but even generative AI tools being able to create these things. It's one thing to say this is true, it's another thing to actually be true. And so in some sense, technology makes us feel like we can change reality to how we like it to be, what we desire it to be. And it gives us that kind of false sense of security, but it also kind of deludes the nature of truth, that it's something fixed and objective outside of us. It's not something we decide for ourselves, but that God has created. He's created a reality. He's created the nature of truth, and these things are fixed and objective. I'm not as concerned about the rise of generative AI in the sense of misinformation per se, but also not just generating that stuff, but also giving the ability for those to say, well, that's fake, or I can't trust that. And I think that really gets at what you're getting at, Orlin, is that it's creating a culture of suspicion. It's kind of pouring fuel on a fire, which is going to be a very tough thing to navigate, not just in an election season, but even just moving forward, where the very nature of truth isn't something that's fixed and discoverable, something that is able to be obtained, but something that seems to fluctuate with cultural winds and political ideas. And what we need to do often, I think, with technology is not to uncritically embrace it, but also not to uncritically reject it. We need to slow down, ask some of those fundamental questions, and know there's a difference between someone and something. I think especially in this age AI debate, especially with robots and all sorts of different generative AI tools, there's something fundamentally different between a human being and a machine, someone and something. And I think that paradigm sometimes will help us to understand what's really going on here and how to combat that as Christians, being able to speak truth into a very chaotic public square at times.
Well, I think, Jason, you've probably hit it right on the head that it is a chaotic space that you're trying to speak truth into. And then there's a group of people that assume that whatever they hear, it must be mixed with untruth. So the idea of there's already a built-in nexus to say no need to believe because we have evidence to demonstrate that most of what we hear has been doctored in some way. But I think the main point we're getting to is that utilizing a lot of this activity and the equipment and the technology is essential if you want to continue to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. There's a case that's called San Jose Korean Central Church versus the Korean Evangelical Church of America. It's a decision that was in the Court of Appeals for the 6th Appellate District of the state of California that rendered a major decision and reaffirmed the cornerstone of American concept of religious liberty, which is significantly different from theories that are prevailing in several European countries. At stake was the so-called procedural noncompliance exception. That is a well-established principle in American law that secular courts cannot second-guess the decisions of ecclesiastical courts, because doing so would violate the corporate religious liberty of the religious organizations that operate such courts. You know, Andre, this has been a very interesting dynamic here. The idea that you can have one court that supposedly does not have the ability to influence another court. As a matter of fact, there was a time where in the law, we had what we called the Chevron deference, in that if you had a question, you would go to the administrative agency or the entity that's close related to it, and they had to be the experts. But it looks as though the courts are not generally functioning that way. And this particular case seems to be pitting two Korean organizations from a religious perspective against each other under that same concept. You know, when you take a look at that, how do we try to get through this process and even explain to people exactly what's really going on here?
Yeah, so the procedural noncompliance exception is commonly called ministerial exception, which is really the separation of church and state. I mean, it's the courts not getting involved in church-related ecclesiastical decisions, and it's something that the religious organizations, including the one that I work for and represent, enjoys, but we need to be very cautious when relying on this exception for a number of reasons. The first is that it should never be treated as a blanket exception. The application of this exception really needs to be examined on a case-by-case basis review, because just using it as a sword rather than as a shield will not serve the organization well. But also, that the church should always remember that there's always a potential cost when you exercise this exception. There are reputation costs, ministry disruption costs, negative press and public scrutiny costs. So while the church does enjoy this kind of independence and deference from the courts, it's something that needs to be, it's a tool that the churches need to wield very cautiously.
You know, Blayre, in these type of cases, really the real concern is you give churches the power to discriminate. And once you have that power to be able to, quote unquote, discriminate because of your religious beliefs, the concern is, are you going to continue to operate in a way where you use that protection that you get as a shield and not using it as a sword? And that seems to be the big question that comes up, even when you have churches that are pitted against each other.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. And I when I was looking at this case, it was interesting because the leadership who brought the issue was actually being excommunicated, and it was losing his ordination privileges, right? Pastor Chung, and he was kind of upset or the team was upset because he took a vote after he was suspended to disrupt another church, right? And I think, from the church's perspective, they were in the right to say, you can't take this vote. You're excommunicated, right? I think that happens a lot in churches where you have to be mindful of who leadership is and who they're swaying and who they're encouraging. Nevertheless, I felt like it was very dangerous for the court to reach its hand into the pocket of a church, right? And to say, okay, well, you're not allowed to hold this position anymore. You are no longer ordained by this church. That for me felt very dangerous because it's a slippery slope when the Supreme Court, when the courts begin to reach their hand into churches and say, this is what it's going to be. This is who's in leadership. This is who's on the board. This is who can make the decisions. It then begins to blur the lines of separation of church and state, right? And so while I do believe that the decision made in this instance was correct, the way it was made by the courts was very disheartening for me, to be honest. We have to keep that line clear because then it'll continue to happen denominationally, right? And as Seventh-day Adventists, we're very well aware of the fact that we want to be mindful and very careful of the influence that courts have in our religious disposition and beliefs.
Dr. Martin, you've been somebody who's been in an administrative position and had to be involved in decisions regarding what happens with ministers in your conference under your review and your purview. And it starts to get a little dicey when you now have the courts that are coming in and kind of telling you what should be happening, and sometimes even, quote unquote, in violation of what may be believed as a church. As somebody who's been a minister of the gospel and also has to be involved from an administrative standpoint, How do we try to make sure that we are treating our fellow men who are employees with the best care possible, even though sometimes you have the power to be a little bit more aggressive just simply because you've gotten that power given to you by the government?
Well, I think what's happening in this day and age is the line, as my sister has said, between church and state is rather blurry nowadays. Even though this is a case that's I'm not familiar with in our country, but in our country, I noticed that there are a number of things that are taking place as church and state sort of get a little closer together. I'm glad that one of our senators, our key senator, actually Chuck Schumer, gave a little synopsis, a little greeting to us at our camp meeting. One of the things he said was he admired the fact that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is very strong when it comes to a stand on religious liberty to keep church and state separate. And I'm one of those, and you know this, all. I'm very, very engaged with political figures and the powers that be in my community. But one thing I do stress to them is, even though I may be influential, so that certain decisions are being made in behalf of some of my members, still we have to keep church and state separate. We have to watch how far we go with that.
You know, Jason, one of the things obviously you spend a lot of work with is in the area of ethics. And there probably is no better topic in terms of how to utilize the power granted to churches by government. And on one hand, sometimes you find yourself making decisions that you think may be in the best interest, but the question are they in the best ethical interest? And as you go out and engage in that, and even as you're working to educate a new generation that's involved, how do you help them to find a balance? Because sometimes it's so easy to go and grab what's in front of you, but sometimes that may not be the best ethical way to move forward.
Yeah, one of the reasons I always love being part of this show is I get to be kind of the token Baptist in some sense. And so speaking from a Baptist perspective, I mean, religious liberty is very central to what we believe as Baptists, not only because we know what happens when religious liberty is not observed and the history of Baptist and especially in kind of Protestantism, but we believe, especially part of our Baptist faith and message as Southern Baptists is, and our article on religious liberty, that a free church and a free state is the Christian ideal. That we want the freedom to be able to believe what we believe about all of life. And this question then is what's that balance? How do we navigate that relationship of religion and the public square? Or as this show is called Faith and Politics. These are overlapping worlds that in some ways are distinct, but also we can't say that your deeply held religious beliefs are not welcomed in the public square, because everyone is operating out of deeply held religious beliefs, whether that's secular or theistic or whatever. Everyone has these deeply held beliefs, and we want the freedom to be able to live those out in all aspects of our life, from our work to our play to our churches. And so I think one of the things that I try to encourage my students is to have a robust understanding of what religious liberty is and also what religious liberty isn't, and that there's a high bar that the government must be able to meet in order to override someone's deeply held religious beliefs. And that's a core tenet, not just of Baptist life, but even of American life, First Amendment cases. It's one of the reasons, especially with the rise of technology and a lot of companies and a lot of content moderation policies and so many things, to rely on over 250 years of case law where we've had to dive into these things. We've had to define these things. We don't have to reinvent the wheel when we have new challenges come our way. And as Baptists have always said, a free church and a free state is the Christian ideal. And I think we have to navigate that, realizing that our Christianity, our faith isn't just a part of our lives, but it really is a holistic aspect of our life. Every single aspect of my life is influenced and shaped by my beliefs. And so we have to be able to balance that alongside the freedom of religion. It's not freedom of worship, it's a freedom of religion in all aspects of life. And so being able to realize that a free church and a free state is the Christian ideal, I think will help us to navigate some of those tensions, defining what we mean and being clear and being very forceful about kind of engaging these things and being a champion for religious liberty wherever it's found.
You know, Andre, what's interesting here is that there'll be some that'll say, well, Mr. Chung actually went through his ecclesiastical, procedures and the court, and an administrative decision was made, and he decided to go into secular court because he just didn't like what he heard. You know, so on one hand, it's like, well, churches should be allowed to do what they do, go through their processes. But then when somebody thinks that it's not fair, is it realistic to say that they should have just kept their business in-house? Or is it something that we should probably encourage people, if you think somebody has basically put you in a negative position, regardless of the religious beliefs or religious organization, something else can be done?
Yeah, and so that's what I do when I advise churches and our administrative organizations, is when issues like this come up, we always look at what potential legal liability that the church may be exposed to if they engage in an ecclesiastical procedure or process or decision. And so, yeah, I mean, that's always a potential. And let me just say this, that the exception can be applied differently in different jurisdictions. So it's inaccurate to say that the exception just applies carte blanche amongst all religious denominations. It's something that actually applies differently to different jurisdictions. So it is important for our ministers and our churches to look at this legally and judicially when exercising church authority.
And I'm gonna have to let that be the last word, but I think the critical point here is when churches go out and get the power to be able to protect themselves, they need to ensure that the actions they are engaging in is being used as not as a sword, but only as a shield, because if you use it as a sword, you're gonna find more enemies coming for you. Hey, Blayre, tell me something I don't know.
Absolutely. While there has been a decline in religion and religious affiliation, there are still nearly 4,000 religions in the world that are recognized faith groups. However, almost 75% of those 4,000 religions, or people who are within those religions, still find themselves affiliating with Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and other Abrahamic traditions.
Wow. Andre, tell me something I don't know.
In 2017, Sophia is a humanoid robot, was granted legal personhood and citizenship in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
Jason, tell me something I don't know.
It sounds silly to say, but just because you see it on the internet doesn't make it true. We all know that. We all believe that. But it's so easy to be deluded, especially in light of a lot of the conversations we had earlier with the rise of misinformation, fake news, and conspiracy theories. You need to be very wise and cautious about the things we see online and being slow to speak and slow to anger and very quick to listen.
Thank you with that. Dr. Martin, tell me something I don't know.
My fear of stepping away from biblical principle and embracing that which is not authentically spiritual, because it comes from the world of AI, or, as we say, artificial intelligence.
Want to thank you for all of that. Great conversation today. And thank you again for being here with us, and hope you enjoyed the conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.